Hi everyone, I'm Nicole Pratt. So, of course, Jan was right in that he had the most important presentation. I would argue I had the coolest presentation, the coolest topic. That's because we're going to talk about causal effect estimation. So we're going to use our observational data to actually try and infer whether a treatment, for example, causes a certain side effect. And that's very hard to do actually, but it is also the thing that, of course, gets the most attention when you publish about it. So in order to do that, we need to actually understand what we mean by causal effect. What does it mean if something causes something? And for that, I'm going to use a little bit of a pop culture reference. So who of you have seen the movie The Matrix? Keanu Reeves. Oh, lots of people haven't seen the movie. That's maybe he's saying how old I am. No longer actually seen the movie. Anyway, it's a movie with Keanu Reeves. Oh, yeah, how I did it. And at a certain point in the movie, he gets a choice between a red pill and a blue pill. If he takes a red pill, then all sorts of weird things will start to happen, or if he takes a blue pill, then life goes back to normal again. In the movie, you see him actually take the red pill, and it's a very exciting movie after that, and things happen. But what you don't see is what would have happened if he had chosen the blue pill. And so that is basically the essence of causality is what would have happened if the choice was made differently. So here we have a patient, or say Keanu, and he comes to this point where he has to decide between the red pill and the blue pill. He decides to take the red pill, and then in this movie we follow him up, and we see what happens at the end. We have an outcome at the end of that process. If we want to know what was the effect of that decision, basically of the red pill versus the blue pill, truly the only way to really understand it is to basically take a time machine, go back in time to the point of the decision, have Keanu make the other choice, following him up, and then see what happened under that scenario. This second scenario, the one that we didn't see in the movie, is called the counterfactual. The counter to what factually happened. And the difference between the factual and the counterfactual, that is actually the effect of the choice that Keanu made, or the patient made. So the point where the decision was made is really the most important point. That's day zero. Anything before that is what we call the baseline, and anything afterwards we call the follow-up of the decision. And so truly this is a true counterfactual answer that for this specific person. Typically we're not interested, well, it's interesting to know what would happen to a single person, but typically we're actually more interested in what is actually the effect of that drug. And so we're actually talking about a population effect. So what if we had a population of people, they're all making a choice, let's say they all choose the red pill, we see what happens to them, we all put them in a time machine, we go back in time and we make the counterfactual happen, and then we compare, well, like what happened to people when they took the red pill and what happened to those exact people when we travel back in time and had them take the blue pill. And then we can see overall, oh, there's the outline summary. Overall, it seemed that slightly more smilier faces on the red pill than on the blue pill, so maybe the red pill is a better pill to take. But unfortunately, in reality, we do not have a time machine. So how do we actually know or try to infer causality? Well, the next best approximation, still just approximation, not really, people think of randomized trials as really the best thing ever, but they're just an approximation of what we really want, which is the time machine. You randomize people, so you take a group of people, the left group you randomly give them the red pill, and the other people you randomly select them and you give them the blue pill. And because those people you randomly selected them, they're basically the same mix of people, like both skinny and white people in both groups, and you have something that's pretty similar to what you would have gotten if you had the time machine. And so you can still make the good calls or inference about the effect of that choice. But we're OHDSI, and so O stands for observational, so we don't even have the luxury of being able to randomize people into treatment. We just see what people have done, what choice they made. So here we have then two options by which we could approximate the randomized trial, which itself is approximating the actual counterfactual that we want. One thing is we could compare different people. We could compare people that took red pills to people that took blue pills, or what we can do is we do a self-control design, where we compare people when they make a choice for a certain exposure to another point in their time, maybe the blue pill at another point in time. So that's called a self-control design. But let's focus now on that first one, which is usually the more common one, where we compare different groups of people. So in our data, we have people that we've observed to take the red pill, we have people that we've observed to take the blue pill. And we can just summarize, so we can do characterization, as Patrick showed you. We characterize the cohort, and we can see what their outcomes are. But here, of course, there could be what could be an issue, in that the people that are taking the red pill, in this case, mostly are the skinny people, and the people taking the blue pill are the white people. And that actually might be a reason why you see different outcomes, not the choice of their drug or treatment. And so here, the exchangeability assumption might be violated. So that's an issue that we have to deal with in our observational data if we want to actually use it to inform purpose. So, the reason why you actually see this quite often is that often there is actually a reason why some people get one drug and some people get the other drug. Like doctors have this idea in their head, okay, this person is at high risk of this specific outcome, so I'm not going to give him this drug, I'm going to give him that drug. But that means that different people will get different treatments. If you just compare them without taking that into account, you will not get the right answer. So to deal with that, there are several ways to deal with that. But in OHDSI, our primary way of dealing with that is using propensity scores. Who of you have heard of propensity scores? That's a fair chunk. Good. All right. So what is a propensity score? So it's the probability of belonging to the target cohort versus the comparator cohort. So the probability of getting the red pill, basically, based on whatever we know about you during your baseline time. So everything up to the decision. So more formally, it's the probability of z equals 1, so treatment being 1, given x, which is everything of the covariates that we have at the time of treatment assignment. This propensity score is interesting in that we can use it as a balancing score. If the two cohorts have the same propensity score distribution, we can actually assert that there are no differences there that would actually affect the causal inference. In OHDSI, we have I would say, a special kind of propensity score, which we call large-scale propensity scores, where we actually, traditionally, the way that people do propensity scores is an expert thinks really hard about what confounders could be. They come up with a list of 10, 20 variables, and those go into the model. It's very hard to figure out actually what confounders are, and in fact, I think the experts mostly are often going to be wrong or missing something. So in OHDSI, we do an automated approach where you have the dates, the index date where they make the decision, and you take all the data before that, and just use all the data that you have. So we talked about the common data model this morning. You know you have conditions, drugs, procedures, and observations. So why not create a covariate for each and every one of those things? So every concept I need basically gets its own covariate, and actually usually multiple covariates. Was this drug observed in the 30 days prior, in the 180 days prior, in the 365 days prior? So lots and lots of covariates we construct somewhere between 10,000 and 100,000 usually, but it's all done automatically, so you don't have to think about it, and you don't have to worry about it. When you're designing such a study, as Marc will show you how to do later on, one important thing though that you have to keep in mind, we do include everything, which also means we're going to include, if you're not careful, we're going to actually include the treatments that you're going to compare. So if you're going to compare two drugs, those covariates will include those drugs, and that's bad because now the model will be completely predictive because it actually, the answer is already in the predictor. So you have to manually take those out of the set of covariates. See people nodding, so that makes sense, because usually it's a bit complicated, but mainly the gist of it is when you're designing your study, you will have one field that says covariates to exclude, and there you just have to, usually you just pick the two drugs that you're comparing to exclude there. It can be a little bit more tricky if, for example, one drug is an injectable and the other is not, then you also probably have to exclude the injection procedure code. If you forget one of those things, don't worry. The method, actually, the software is going to yell at you and say you made a mistake because something is perfectly predictive of the treatment. Anyway, so using all these covariates, the model will, a predictive model will be fitted, and that will generate a propensity score for you, all fully automatic. You no longer have to think very hard about what confounders are and whatnot. So what do you do with those propensity scores? So every person now has a propensity score, the probability that they were going to get the treatment based on what we know about them. So there are four things that people do with propensity scores. You can just put the propensity score in your outcome model. You can do matching, stratification, and inverse probability weighting. And I'll explain matching and stratification a little bit more later on. That first one, regression adjustment, so just putting the propensity score in your model is usually not done because that assumes linearity, which is usually not true. So people don't really do that. These other three are fully implemented in our software, so you can just select them by pushing the button. Inverse probability weighting, everybody else outside of OHDSI likes this a lot because theoretically it's the best thing to do. We've done several empirical evaluations where it actually is the worst thing to do. So we tend to not do inverse probability weighting, and reviewers will yell at you saying you need to do that, but you can point to our paper saying that it's not a good idea. Or you can do it, but then you use negative controls, you'll see why it's not a good idea. Anyway, so matching, the way that works is basically it matches people that have the same or similar propensity scores. So the skinny person is matched to a regular person is matched to a regular person, a white person is matched to a white person, a skinny to a skinny. We throw everyone else away, and all of a sudden our two groups are actually similar in composition, and now we can just summarize the cohorts and we can look at their outcomes. Stratification works fairly similar in that instead we just create strata, so we have a strata of white people, strata of like medium people, and a strata of narrow people, and within those strata we're now going to create summaries, and then we're basically going to average across the effect across these strata. And so after matching or after stratification, then actually you can just do correct causal inference and actually infer the effect. So now you've created these comparable groups, and we actually have diagnostics that Marc will go into to confirm that they actually now are comparable. But suppose that they are comparable, then the question is, well, what kind of model are we going to fit after that? And that depends on what your research question actually was. We basically have three options that we currently have implemented: logistic regression, Poisson regression, and a dark proportional hazard model. I'm going to go into all of the details, but logistic regression is basically answering the question, did it happen or not? So it's a binary thing. and you compute an odds ratio. The Poisson regression is basically asking the question, did it happen, was the rate higher in one group than the others, which takes time into account, whereas the distant regression does not, so that produces the rate ratio. And then the most common thing to do is a Cox proportional hazard model. So this looks at the time to event. Was the time to event shorter in the target cohort compared to the target cohort, and that produces a hazard ratio. So I think one of the important innovations that we've done actually in OHDSI is, maybe it looks a little bit boring, is that we created this sort of a template to fill in when you design a study. So the designing the study now becomes really just answering 5 questions. What is your target cohort? What is your comparator cohort? What is your outcome cohort? What is your time at risk? And what is your outcome model? And so Chan wasn't lying in saying that he had the most important presentation, because 3 of these is cohorts that you have to define. And if you don't know how to define cohorts, you're already stuck there. So your target cohort, well, we'll look at that a little bit later. So it could be one drug, comparator cohort, another drug, and then an outcome, maybe a side effect that you're worried about. The time at risk, so relative to starting the drug, what time do we want to actually compute our estimate for? Is it the time that people are on drug, or is it the first 30 days, or could be different choices? And model specification is the 3 choices that I just gave you. So one thing where OHDSI is also very unique compared to other initiatives or other studies people are doing is also this idea of negative controls. And I think that actually is one of the most important things that you can do in your study, because those can actually tell you whether the evidence that you're producing is actually reliable. So what are negative controls? So I usually use this example, which is a paper that was published a long time ago by Zelstra and colleagues, where they looked at whether childhood diseases cause later on multiple sclerosis. And so, for example, they looked at 3 diseases: infectious, mononucleosis, rubella, and the measles, and then they measured whether people later on got multiple sclerosis. And so they computed odds ratio for all 3, and all 3 were statistically significant. But to their credit, these researchers weren't entirely sure whether the methodology that they used was 100% reliable, because they basically asked people about their childhood diseases, and that can introduce recall bias. So they also added 3 negative controls, which are things that they firmly believe could not cause multiple sclerosis: a broken arm, a concussion, and adult colectomy. And sure enough, so they used exactly the same method to produce answers for that. And sure enough, for 2 out of those 3, they also found statistically significant associations. So they're sure that the null hypothesis is true, yet they're rejecting the null hypothesis for 2 out of 3, meaning that, yeah, something fishy is going on. The next step that they took, I'm not completely agreeing with. They said, okay, well, so apparently if the null is true, you can still see a odds ratio of 1.25, so that's basically close to rubella and measles, so we're eliminating those. But this one, 2.22, that's so far away from these 3 that we're going to actually claim in our title that is the cause. I find that a bit too far-fetched, because what if they added one more negative control? That one had an odds ratio of 2 or something. So what we do in OHDSI, we tend to not use just 3, but more 50 or 100 negative controls. That makes it much easier to do statistics. If you think about a comparative cohort study, well, what does a negative control look like? Because we actually have 2 exposures, the target and the comparator. And so what we typically choose is things that are neither caused by the target nor the comparator. And so if neither of them cause them, then if you compare the 2, then the relative risk for hazard ratio should still be 1. We select somewhere between 50 to 100 negative controls, some outcomes per study. And actually, Atlas can help you do that. Because you might think, whoa, 50 negative controls is a lot. How am I going to do that? Luckily, Atlas has a feature, and Marc is going to show you how that works. Behind it is a whole lot of machinery. So all you do is maybe enter your target comparative drug, and it gives you a list of candidate outcomes. What's behind that is there's a huge database that has information about it from all the product labels, from the scientific literature, so from PubMed and from spontaneous reporting, and it basically gives you the outcomes that, according to those three sources, have no causal relationship with your exposure. So it's a lot of work that it does for you, and then you get a list of 100, 200 candidates that you can then manually review to get to that list of 50 to 100 if you want to include in your study. Like I said, I think that's one of the most important things to do in an OHDSI study is to have those negative controls to show that you actually have the bias. And that's also, if you want to argue about inverse probability weighting, or I don't even care if you want to do a case control study, and people know that I dislike case control studies very much. I don't care if you do that or not. What I care about is that you use negative controls. So that will actually tell you why I don't care, that I don't like those study designs, and why we don't like, for example, inverse probability weighting, because those negative controls will tell you which design works and which one didn't. And so actually, it is quite often that we do multiple designs, and then we let the negative controls tell us which design we're actually going to move forward with to answer our question. And not until we actually are sure, based on the negative controls, that we're going to get a good answer, do we actually look at the answer. All right, and now Marc, you're up. Oh, before I throw Marc on the deep end, are there any questions? I fill out a lot of data information. All right.
No questions?
I was so clear.
How many people want to watch this?
So while I'm pushing the screens again, I'd like to say that Chan got the most important. We all know about the right? Martijn certainly got the coolest one, although people don't know about the matrix anymore, so they might not realize how cool it is. But I get the most practical lecture, because I'm going to invite you all to play along with me with your own Atlas setups while we reproduce a small part of the legend hypertension study. In order to do that, I need to get one single display somehow. So we'll go back to here and try to ask a little much better on my end. I'm not going to focus on any specific window because I'll be popping back and forth between a couple of different applications to make sure we all have access to what we're doing. But in order to start, I would like everyone to go back to our demo setup of Atlas, because we will use Atlas to construct a new user comparative effectiveness study that's looking at the relative risk of angioedema compared between individuals who start using lisinopril versus hydrochlorothiazide, kind of the running discussion that we've used throughout the day. So I would like to stop for a moment and ask, has anyone had issues bringing up our Atlas box up here on elasticbeanstalk.com, where that seems to be okay for most?
The screen? Is there a way that we can shoot the screen?
Well, I'm certainly going to change the size. And most importantly, I'm going to type with one hand and hold this with the other. I have to say, kudos goes out to Chan and Patrick for being able to do that. I don't think my skills are going to be nearly as good.
It is fast.
Patrick gave us an opportunity to learn about characterization, cohort pathways, incidence rates, and now we're going to go to the estimation panel. When you go to the estimation panel, it first brings up a list of existing cohort comparison studies that have already been designed. So after this class, please go back and take a look at the one that we put together specifically for lisinopril versus hydrochlorothiazide. But don't look at it now, because I'd like you all to create your own along with me. We're going to start with the, let's see if we can get this. No, we can't even get it all on the screen. We're going to start by clicking a new population level estimation analysis. In OHDSI, we talk about population level estimation. It's really causal inference, but that pisses off our causal inference friends, so we call it something a little different. In order to define this, we'll start by giving it a unique name so we don't overwrite everyone else's. And I'm going to type briefly and quickly hit save before somebody else takes that name from me. Martijn mentioned that there were 5 key components that we need to define for a cohort method design. Would somebody like to tell me what the first 3 of those were? Song this, okay, we'll start with song.
Target, comparator, and alpha.
That's right, we need to define the cohorts, because defining a cohort was the
Most important.
Oh, exactly, the most important part of the day. So we're going to start with a comparison. In the comparison, we're going to add our target and our comparator. So I will hit add comparisons, and you'll see that there are basically 3 boxes, TC, and later a set of O's. If you go to the little file, it will bring up a list of all of the cohorts that have already been defined in Atlas. So this will start to give you an idea of the sort of the modularity of the pieces that we're building and how they can be reused for additional purposes. I'm going to search in this case, as we were actually, all of us are going to search together in this case for our new user lisinopril cohort. And it looks like a whole bunch of it added since I played with this beforehand. And I'm going to pick a slightly different definition than the one that Chan walked us through. And we'll talk a bit about those differences in a minute. So we have lisinopril. And now I'm going to we all together are going to quickly add its comparator. Hydro. And again, I'm going to look for the name that looks almost exactly the same, hoping that their definitions are quite similar. So for both of these, I picked 2 cohorts. So let's look at one of those. Let's look at the lisinopril cohort. But both of them say for, sort of first line use and prior hypertension.
Marc, don't say lisinopril.
Excuse me.
You're picking the same one.
I did.
Yeah, you lower, I use 25 volts.
All right, would somebody like to predict what our hazard ratio is going to be? 1. But how about fitting our propensity score? Are we going to do a good job of that?
I think so.
Actually, we probably will, right? I mean, it's going to be 50-50 if we have the perfect, we have the perfect model. All right, so we'll fix that before we actually execute anything. Oh, the names have gotten changed. It's the 1, right? So we'll refresh our memories about what these cohorts look like. They have their cohort entry criteria, and in this case, we're looking for new users, so individuals who have not previously used lisinopril anytime in their look-back period. And we're defining a new user by not having exposure for 365 days before that index. And we're only going to look at the first time interval in which that holds true to call them a new user. In addition, there are 3 inclusion criteria. There's the prior hypertension inclusion criteria, which we all built into our cohorts previously earlier today, and 2 additional criteria to help us model the Legend hypertension study. Now, cardiologists are rather cavalier, and they think that, well, if 1 drug is good, then 2 drugs is probably better. So depending on the individual, an individual may start on a single agent or actually start on 2 agents called a combo drug on the first day. And so to increase comparability between our cohorts, we're going to restrict ourselves to individuals who have not prior had exposure to any other hypertensive agent. And on the day that they start, they're just going to start on monotherapy. Notice I don't have an age restriction in here, but imagine that I did have an age restriction, but then I did not have that restriction for my target comparator with hydrochlorothiazide. So that my 2 cohorts differed in 2 different ways. They differed in their exposure to the different drugs and also the age distribution of the individuals. How might that affect my causal inference? Let's have some thumbs up for a good idea, thumbs down for a bad idea.
Bad idea.
It's a bad idea. The way to think about it is there's 2 differences between my exposures. There's both the drug and the age difference. So in a sense, I wouldn't be able to tell if my hazard ratio was reflecting an effect of the drug, affecting a difference in the age categories, or affecting how age interacts with the drug itself. So part of the nice modularity of our cohort definition, because our cohorts are very modular, you can construct copies that are exactly the same of each other, hydrochlorothiazide instead of lisinopril, but everything else is the same, so that our causal estimate at the end is reflecting just the one change in our cohorts. And that's quite important and a nice feature of our modularity here. So again, we decided that my comparisons were not a good idea, or we wouldn't actually have to run the study if we had those, right? Let's choose this one this time. And we can pick an outcome. One of the nice features of our modularity is we can set up our study so we can look at multiple outcomes simultaneously. So we could pick several of these, and the package design that we had would look at the T and C that we picked across multiple O's. This is exactly the same mechanism that we use for looking at the negative controls. So in this case, I'm going to pick, just for sake of argument, our acute MI, and I can import it, and then I can go back and add more outcomes for other outcomes that you want. I think this is the best angioedema definition that there is. And so after you've selected your target comparator,
Mark.
oh yeah.
Yeah, just asking a question.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, on behalf of our audience. So we pick all these concepts, right? The IDs, right? We can, besides searching by the concepts, the IDs are unique, identifying every single sort. These outcome concepts or cohorts that we define.
So these unique ID numbers are specific to the Atlas instance in which they're stored. When you export them into your study package, you can change them to other numbering systems that you want. They are simply bookkeeping devices. The important information that gets moved over is the JSON and SQL definition of these cohorts. And that's a great example of the ability to move cohort definitions between different studies themselves. You don't actually have to go through the Atlas intermediate. However, in setting up your package, in order for it to execute correctly, you do need to make sure that all of your cohorts do have unique IDs, and that comes down to their unique representation in the cohort table itself.
Yeah.
That's
Sorry, so internally, right, within the same node, because the name sometimes can be confusing, right? Because like with and without, then you may miss it and get it wrong. So at least for us, maybe we use the ID internally within the same site to uniquely identify the cohort that we work with. Together with the name, we make it easier to make sure that like different engineers or different people looking at Atlas, we are talking about the same thing. Yeah, just a tip, yeah, sure.
Yeah. Something that we haven't looked at is unique identification of reused cohorts across studies. And that's a topic that we should explore. We should explore more.
Alright, so Mr. Everybody, the top one was 25, bottom one was 24, the cohort, and then we picked 29 and 81. Easier to find.
But it's okay because we actually don't have time to execute the whole study in the 20
I'm sure
minutes.
they'll get the red button.
In the 20 minutes that Martijn left me. There are a number of baseline features about these individuals that we might want to exclude from our study, particularly in constructing our propensity score model. What might those be? So baseline features include what happens on day 0. What happened on day 0 for all of our new users of these 2 drugs who just started drugs?
They got the drug.
They got the drugs. So if we were to include, as Martijn mentioned, lisinopril and hydrochlorothiazide in all of their descendants, those would be completely predictive of their assignment. So in this study, we need to exclude those concepts. This again will bring up a new concept list, and I've already constructed a concept set which just includes lisinopril and hydrochlorothiazide and all of their descendants. So we're going to exclude those from our entire analysis. That ends our specification of our target and comparator in terms of the comparisons that we're going to look at. So TCO, what were the other 2 components? Yeah, so the time at risk and the model. You can add those in right here in your analysis settings. There are a large number of analysis settings. Let me quickly look at the time to see how much time I'm going to spend on them. 15 minutes. I'm not going to spend too much time on most of them, but we can come back to the ones that I don't discuss. When you're looking at 2 exposures, and those exposures have different histories, like one might be a drug that just came on market relatively later than the other one, or in this case it's, hydrochlorothiazide was around before lisinopril, so we might want to restrict ourselves to patients who have the exposure to the drug only during a common period when it is reasonable that they could have received both of those 2 treatments. So one way to do that right here is to restrict our study period to when both exposures are present. We need to ask the question, are we looking at our model individuals for their first exposure or future exposures that they might have? Now our design here are new users, and the cohorts that we've constructed already restrict ourselves to first exposure, but that's not always the case. So for safety, I'm just going to say yes. The minimum continuous observation period. You may recall in the cohort that Chan helped us create, we had already a minimum look-back period of 365 days, but that might not be in the reusable T&C that you have, and you can change that specification here as well. And then there's the question of what do we do with individuals who are in both the target and the comparator cohort, perhaps at separate times. Since we're looking here at new users of 2 drugs, their first exposure, and we've already excluded prior exposure to any other hypertensive agent, that is not a huge concern in this specific study, but it can be in many that you generate. And so we've provided 3 different options. You can include those subjects in both the target and comparator, especially if you're looking at short-term effects. You can keep the first. So if I first started on lisinopril and then some later time in my history switched over to hydrochlorothiazide, the record that you keep of me in this study would be the first individual. The other option is you could remove all. If if I have that most exposure, you can throw that out. In general, I don't recommend taking that setting. That I was in both of the exposure groups at some time is very suggestive of how I responded to being in one of those exposure groups. And so there might be some confounding between either confounding by indication, suggesting that I moved to the other group, or direct confounding with the outcome itself. For example, I started on lisinopril. It did not control my blood pressure, so I am at increased risk of having a heart attack. And so I then switched over to another drug. So in this case, we're looking at new users, so I'll just keep the first. If you have overlap, when do you want to censor for individuals that are in both of those cohorts? And then the question about, do we want to remove individuals who had an acute outcome before they actually entered the exposure? And in Legend, we decided to throw out individuals, for example, who had an MI before their first exposure to an antihypertensive. The idea that individuals who have the prior outcome are more likely to have recurrent outcomes, and so represent a slightly different population. You have to specify a time frame in which you want to look back for those prior outcomes, and in this case I'm going to use 365 days. And then there's an option for some subsampling. Finally, we need to define our time at risk. And again, a lot of things happen to individuals on day 0, the day when they're first enter the cohort. So we're going to start our time at risk from the day after day 0, from day 1, after the cohort start date. And in this case, our time at risk is going to be until the point when they stop taking or are censored for their first hypertensive drug. Martijn mentioned we have different choices on the propensity score model, and given the time, I'm just going to quickly go through this and say we're going to match on the propensity score models. So we're going to do a 1-to-1 matching. And we're going to use regularization when we fit this propensity score model, because it can have somewhere between 10,000 and 100,000 different covariates. In this case, we're going to use a Cox proportional hazards model because we're interested in looking at the relative hazard, or the increased intensity in which an individual will have an event. And we want to use the time until that event as additional information. Under the Cox proportional hazard model and also on regression and logistic regression, you have the option of conditioning on the different strata that we're using. I should tell you that if you have a stratified analysis, so a propensity score stratified analysis, you do need to stratify your outcome model, because that's where the information from the stratification comes in. In this case, we used 1-to-1 matching, so there's no need to stratify because we have a as perfectly balanced as the next best thing to the DeLorean might give us. We have this as perfect as we can sort of balanced groups. So since we're doing 1-to-1 matching, I will not conditionalize. I should say that if you have variable ratio matching, it is a good idea to stratify on those different variable ratio matched groups, because there is some intrinsic difference in sort of their size and the information that they import in the analysis that you're doing. So that defines the 5 key aspects. However, as Martijn stressed, in OHDSI, we don't take theory for granted, because in many cases, theory doesn't represent what happens in practice. And one of the most important things that happens in practice is we have observational data, which is fraught with residual systematic error. So in order to adjust for that residual systematic error, or learn what sort of the size is, we're going to include a large set of negative controls. First, I'm going to show you how to input them, you create a concept set, and I'll take a step back on how to create that, your set of negative control outcomes. And so one's already been created, and it goes in there. So let me take a short diversion into how you can start to construct a set of negative control outcomes. And to do this, I'm going to go, not want that. Let's see how long this takes to view again. Oh, well, it might take a long time. I'm going to go to the Atlas demo instance of Atlas because this has the common evidence model built in. We have a concept set that includes two concepts, lisinopril and hydrochlorothiazide, and all of their descendants. To get a putative list of negative controls for these two drug exposures, we can go directly to the common evidence model under the Explore Evidence tab. What this common evidence model does, Martijn explained, it takes a look at those concepts, it looks at product labels, literature, and spontaneous reports, and pulls out condition occurrences in the data that are not linked to any of the product labels, scientific literature, or spontaneous reports. So you hit View Evidence, and unfortunately I hit the back, so it got rid of all of my evidence. And you'll see that it has generated a list of about 13,000 different putative negative controls that you can use. This list currently is sorted. You can sort this list in order of prevalence, or at least record count, within the data set that you're looking at. And, excuse me, yes? It certainly is.
So one thing to point out with this list, though, is the default ordering is wrong.
Yes.
So.
But you can pick, we'll just do it by record count, for example. Or we'll try to. Right? So what comes up are things that you might expect, are quite common condition occurrences that are, in this case, believed not to be related to the two different exposures. For example, diabetes is very common, AFib is very common, chest pain. This is a putative list. Now you need some expert opinion to sift through this and pick those which are judged not to be related to any of the two exposures, or for example, in this case, the choice of which drug that you're going to be look for. And we suggest that as you go through this list, you pull out on the order of 100 different negative controls that have about the same prevalence in your database as your specific outcomes of interest. Using 100 allows you to examine the statistical properties of the negative controls, to find out how good is your design, and if your design is, and then adjust for any residual systematic error that it might identify in the design yourself. The final step to execute this study is first to hit the save button. And then if you go to download, you can type in a package name and hit download, and Atlas will generate an R package, which will instantiate your target comparator and outcome cohorts and negative control outcomes, and execute all of the comparisons that you put in there. I actually don't know how to use Chrome to find my new downloads, so I'm not going to open up the RStudio package itself, especially since we have 5 minutes left. But after you've executed the study, all of the results are packaged together in a Schuemie app, which will allow you to walk through the diagnostics on the work that you've generated to ask yourself, are you generating reliable evidence? and if you are, to look at the results themselves. So this is going to be really small in the back of the room. That is not my fault at all. That's just an artifact of Schuemie and the lack of real good control that we have. So here's the Evidence Explorer for the study that we've just put together. You can select the target group. In this case, we're looking at new users of lisinopril versus new users of hydrochlorothiazide, and in this case, for the outcome of angioedema. For the time being, we're not going to look at the estimates themselves, but first we're going to walk through what some of the diagnostics are for this specific study, and to show you that we have, through this study package in your execution, generated all of the artifacts that you need to put together a publication describing this work. There are a number of different tabs that come up in the Evidence Explorer. The first is the power that tells you about the population for your analytic cohort. These are the individuals after matching or stratification that are going into your outcome model to generate your evidence. So after matching, we have nominally 10,000 individuals who start either on lisinopril or hydrochlorothiazide. The number of events in the two groups is 24 versus 14. But an important diagnostic on this panel is the minimally detectable risk. This is an estimate of the minimal risk size for which you have 80% power for identifying a difference. So you'll notice in this specific data set, we have very little power to find a risk difference of about 1.2, 1.3, which is what we might expect this to be if it were really true. Turns out we only have 80% power to find something at 2.5. So if you were interested in looking at lisinopril versus hydrochlorothiazide, you should consider a network study which could allow you to draw information from multiple data sources in this particular case. For each of these individuals, we have the time distributions of their observation time after their exposure. And we see that on median, we're examining individuals for almost 5 months before either they switch drugs or their last follow-up, and our maximum is on the order of tens of years. We have plenty of follow-up information. We might ask, where did all of our subjects go? And you'll like to know what your attrition is for your different inclusion criteria. So the attrition table brings that information up. As Chan mentioned, he likes to put most of his inclusion, actually I think it was Bui said she puts all of her, except for the initial event, all of her inclusion criteria in the Atlas tab that says additional inclusion criteria. And one reason you might think about following the Bui model is those additional criteria, those criteria end up in your attrition table. So if you're interested in learning how many did I lose because I limited myself to adults over 65, for example, or how many did I lose because I limited myself to individuals with some sort of documented history of hypertension within the last year, those will fall into your attrition table if you put them in the additional criteria. Turns out in this case we lost most of our individuals because we were doing one-to-one matching, and we had quite imbalanced cohorts to begin with. In this particular data set, there are 3 times as many individuals starting on lisinopril than hydrochlorothiazide. That's actually not that different than many other large claims databases as well. Population characteristics. Patrick already spent some time going over the table 1 for your manuscript using the characterization panel. This is sort of a repeat of that material, looking at your 2 cohorts, your target and comparator, and their baseline characteristics. The slight difference here is this doesn't just report the baseline characteristics of your target and comparator, but it also reports what those look like after our propensity score adjustment. So this allows you not only to look at what your initial cohorts were, but how well they are matched to each other after your propensity score matching criteria with a standard deviation, with a standardized difference of a mean statistic that we'll look at on several other panels. Let's start with looking at before and after characteristics between our populations and asking did our propensity score approach adjust for those differences. So we'll do that through the covariate balance plot. Many studies that you'll look at, particularly those published outside of OHDSI, as Martijn mentioned, will examine covariate balance on 20 or so features, which have been hand-picked, and certainly don't give you the wealth of information about how balanced are these covariates on all of the other information that we have about them. One of the nice features of having this automated approach is we can look at the balance of all of these tens of thousands of features at once. You'll notice that before propensity score adjustment, there are a large number of features which demonstrate a lack of balance between the two cohorts, meaning one cohort has a much higher proportion or larger value than the other. What one is looking for in terms of diagnostics here is that after propensity score adjustment, that this difference is smaller than some nominal value. And there is a rule of thumb out there, which was mostly pulled out of the air if you attended or watched Martijn's talk from the OHDSI Symposium. But that rule of thumb value is about 0.1. And here we see that although before, along the x-axis, there's huge skew in these covariates. Where did the cursor go? After matching the y-axis up and down, there is plenty of match here. We are, as far as I know, slightly over time, so I'm going to finish with perhaps the second most important panel. So we have Chan's talk on the cohorts, the most important talk. The most important panel was for covariate balance. The second most important panel that I would sway to is systematic error. So these are scatter plots or funnel plots of our negative control estimates that we can use to assess both the design of our study and what the effect of adjusting for that residual systematic error looks like after that adjustment. So let's start with the uncalibrated estimates and orientate ourselves to this plot. Along the x-axis, we have the hazard ratio. Since these are negative controls, we expect the null value of a hazard ratio of 1, plus or minus some error. And of course, that error is reflected by the standard error of that point estimate. So nominal statistical significance turns out to be above or below this diagonal line. So in a well-designed study, without much residual systematic error, we expect to find about 95% of those negative controls to be above that V. And we'll see here that above the V, there's about 91%. So that's actually good evidence that this is a pretty good design, even without calibration. And even if you don't want to do calibration, whatever design you choose, please look at the distribution of systematic error. You'll be really surprised about how bad some choices, like a case-controlled study, might actually look here. After calibration, it turns out we actually over-calibrate, but that has to do with the stochastic work here. So finally, we'll return to our estimate. Of course, we find a hazard ratio of 1.7, saying that individuals with lisinopril, it's suggestive that they have an increased risk, in this case, of angioedema. And with that, I'm going to quit before Rui pulls me off and entertain a question or two.
I want to ask, Marc, so you published last year that the number 2 or legend project, which was using the method. do you think what is the most important part in that study, whether it has the really big data network across the countries or the ethical evaluation or calibration or the robustness of our study is more important. So which one is more important, the most important thing in that study?
So you're asking about what is sort of the most important aspect?
Yeah, whether you use either using the big data network or using evaluating the evidence by several measures such as balance, preference scores, or
So I have a very hard time thinking what the most important aspect was. The legend hypertension study continues to have increasing clinical impact. In that, we've seen it mentioned in Up to Date. One of the predictions that came out of legend hypertension was about the relative effect of chlorthalidone versus hydrochlorothiazide. And that prediction was made almost 4 years before the end of what is the largest randomized controlled trial in hypertension in the last 2 decades, which just reported out with results that were completely consistent with the observational data that we have. Publishing that, a large observational study in a high impact clinical journal is quite difficult because observational data traditionally hasn't kept the same, doesn't carry with it the same sense of reliability as randomized controlled trials. But I think our work from a theoretical perspective on showing what reliable evidence might look like and demonstrating this across large domains with huge clinical impact is certainly changing those beliefs. And as we move forward, it's going to become easier and easier to help augment what we learn from randomized controlled trials with very reliable observational